Is this thing on? I'm not really good at this whole internet thing. My generation was keener on face-to-face interactions, not stuff like this. After years of therapy though, my doctor thinks that maybe it's just the thing I need. My name is Robert Mason, and I have one of the worst cases of siderodromophobia. I'm sorry, but I just can't help to feel this is all pointless. Most likely, there's nothing any of you can say to make me feel any better. I'll never ride the subway again. What happened to me all those years ago, it had to have been a 1 in a million experience. I've never seen or heard anything like it since. Nothing in the newspaper, nothing on TV. If anyone has ever come close to experiencing the same thing, they've been just as spooked as I was, as I still am some nights, when the nightmares blur with reality. It was New York in the 1980s, the era of bright clothes and poofy hair. I was just a fresh-faced youth, with some not-so-clean acne, and sporting a mullet. Back in the day, the subway may not have been the greatest place to be, but if you kept your wits about you, you'd most likely be alright. It got me from home to school, to work and back again. My folks weren't really thrilled with the idea of me riding the subway, because, well, as I explained, it was never really the best place to be, especially back then. The graffiti-stained tunnels, the homeless living and defecating down there, not to mention the drug use. Being the hothead that I was, though, none of that mattered to me. Nothing could scar me. Besides, my dad was a factory worker, and my mom worked 18 hours plus as a nurse, and they still barely cleared 20 grand a year. A car was just out of the question. And what I now look back at as a sad attempt to make myself feel higher up on the social ladder, I like to pretend that the subway was my own personal limousine, complete with my very own driver and everything. Just a lot smellier and about as dirty and disrespected as a public restroom. One Saturday evening I'll never forget. I was exhausted as hell. A good buddy of mine had called in sick, so I had to come into work on my day off and cover for him. The car I was in was extremely packed, and there was a guy who had insanely long fingernails. I can remember feeling sick when I watched him gnaw at his fingernails like some nasty bedtime snack. I'd like to pretend that was dirt underneath them, but God knows what it really was. Gross as it was, I sat back in my seat and tried my best to ignore it, and maybe get in a cat nap until my stop came up. About 20 minutes went by, and finally, the man decided to take a break from his late night fingernail feast, and sit right next to me of all places. Either he hadn't bathed in a week, or he had freshly crapped his pants. I'm not sure which of the two thoughts made me feel any better. I tried any ploy to think of to get this guy to leave me alone. Pretended to be fast asleep, turned opposite of him. Alas, he still felt the need to tap me on the shoulder. "Excuse me there, young man. Have you heard the good news?" His crusty lips had to pry themselves apart as he muttered the question. "What's that?" I responded, being a smartass. "You discovered a toothbrush? Man, have I got news for you. Find some toothpaste and just add water. You'll be amazed." No, silly young man. My insult took the one-way express, and just went right through what was clearly an empty head. "You must be confused. I'm talking about Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Let me just take a moment to get this out of the way right now. I'm not a bigoted or racist kind of guy, or whatever you want to call it. I could care less what color or creed you are. It doesn't make any kind of difference to me whatsoever. That being said, I was never exactly the first person at church, when I actually went. I don't particularly care to shake hands with someone who probably didn't even wash them, and religion was just never my style, and there was absolutely no way some strange subway guy was going to magically convert me within the span of a few stops. "Alright, look here, guy," I sighed. My inner smartass was about to re-emerge. "I'm Jewish. Now I don't know if you heard the bad news, but he's not exactly on speaking terms with my people. So why don't you do yourself a favor and find somebody else to talk to?" Suddenly, my face grew numb, and I was seeing stars. That son of a bitch smacked me dead square across the face. Looking back, I more than likely deserved it. But at the moment, boy, I was pissed off. The next thing I knew, he had wrapped his hands around my neck. "You heathen," the man shouted. "You dare come into my sanctuary and mock the good Lord? Blasphemy." If I didn't think this guy had a few screws loose to begin with, what he did next pretty much confirmed my suspicions. Again, I'm no expert, but I'm positive he was quoting scripture that didn't even exist. Boy, ain't you ever heard of Psalms 734, 777? And the good Lord said, "Let he who believes ride on this here train to salvation, and may he look out the windows and remind all those on the tracks below that they have rejected salvation." His hands getting tighter around my neck, I clamored as best as I could. "Get off me, you crazy freak." I had managed to get my hand into my pants pocket and was so close to retrieving my pocket knife. If some of the other people inside the car with us had waited, maybe a millisecond or so longer, I would have perhaps been another statistic. It would have been so easy to just plunge a knife right into his neck and watch him gasp for air as it slowly filled my lungs with relief. I carried it with me for just this situation. If only I could have. Perhaps everything would have transpired differently, but life had other plans for me. Some good Samaritans wrestled the freak off of me and shoved him out onto the station as we arrived at the next stop. They formed a wall around me to make sure he wasn't getting near me again, if he decided to try and reboard. He made no such attempt though. As the doors closed on him, he flattened his hands and face up against the window, giving me the coldest, most emotionless stare I had ever seen before. It is etched into my memory to this day. He looked undoubtedly deranged as he squawked at me, "Find your inner peace, for you die tonight." The revulsion in his words rattled me to my core. The subway started up again and began to pull away. The crazy bastard tried his best to keep up and started yelling about how people like me were a menace to the world. Once we got far enough from the station, he must have given up on his crusade against me, because his screams grew smaller and faded into an unpleasant memory. When it was certain the danger had passed, a couple people who had come to my aid gave me their full and undivided attention. It took what felt like an eternity to finally convince them that I'd be alright. I had assured them that as soon as I made it to my stop, that I would report the incident. What a lie that was, though. I wouldn't have been surprised if my pants went up in flames right there on the spot. I couldn't breathe a word of this to anyone. I believe that would bring about the end of my existence. If my parents heard that I got into a fight on the subway, they'd insist I stop taking it. I'd never be allowed out of their sight ever again, and I'd be the one only being driven to college by his mommy. I had a reputation to uphold. At least this was the days before social media, and cell phones that could warp information light years away with a click of a button. I got up and headed towards the back of the car, where it seemed to be a little less crowded, to take a moment to collect myself. My hysterical heart rate slowly calmed as I leaned back. That was probably the biggest confrontation I had gotten into since middle school. As peace began to flood over me, I noticed that there was one small tender spot on my arm that wasn't going away. Pulling back on my sleeve, I noticed an almost trivial trace of blood that I was not sure I had before. It almost looked like I was poked or prodded with something, so I figured I must have done it to myself while I was trying to retrieve my pocket knife. As I cleaned the blood, my arms began to grow heavy and weak. This miraculous newfound serenity of mine was quickly turning into a siesta. Everything around me began to go blurry. The last thing I remember is vaguely piecing together some muddled conversations with the other passengers, before everything finally went dark. I can't even begin to guess how much time would pass before I opened my eyes again. It's just a good thing I woke back up when I did. Otherwise, I might not be here relaying the story. "Hurry up, he's waking up," the first voice alerted. "Already?" A third voice entered the conversation. "Now, settle down, boys. This is not ideal for him anyway, but at least we've got him right where we need him." That voice sent shivers down my paralyzed spine. I pried my eyes open and took a second to adjust to my surroundings. We weren't in the subway car anymore. No, this was different. This was somewhere in a tunnel. Standing above me was that crazy bastard I fought off earlier. There was some kind of reddish substance smeared all over his face, in crazy symbols. A few that I could actually make out appeared to be pentagrams, or something of that nature. The feeling in my neck began to come back. I slowly jerked it around and tried to make out more of my surroundings. I was right. This guy had two other people with him. They were all huddled around me in a circle. The trio looked almost identical, all completely bald and draped in black robes. The one from earlier that I fought off with seemed to be their leader. He huddled over me like a dark storm cloud. All I could do was peer into his black, bleak eyes as he stared into mine. If his objective was to get me to pray, he succeeded. I would have given anything to be anywhere else in the world. I'm sorry about this, young man. The leader apologized. You weren't supposed to feel any of this. But what's a little pain and sacrifice to the good Lord? You don't have to do this. Oh, but we do, he responded. Through the consumption of contaminated flesh and blood, you shall be made pure again, made whole. He withdrew a rusty knife from within his robe and began to tear away at my shirt, ripping an X in my clothes right by my heart. By this point, I was starting to get feeling back in the rest of my body again, but I need a little bit more time. Since I could now talk a little better, I began running my mouth as fast as I could. Anything to keep him occupied. I'm sorry about earlier, just let me go. Nothing has happened yet. Let's just forget the whole thing. You've seen the inside of our sanctuary. I couldn't possibly let you go now, he responded. Come on, I begged. I'll give you all my money. Bribery? How dare you? One of the man's followers shouted. I tried to spin it any other way I could. No, not bribery. Call it a gift. Think of it as a donation to your sanctuary and your cause. Their leader devilishly chuckled. You're already giving the greatest donation of all. Your body and blood. Suddenly, the feeling started to come back in my arms and legs. I could feel the weight of my wallet and my pocket knife still in my jeans. The crazy bastards must have never even thought about trying to rob me in the first place. Well, thank God they never thought to check for a weapon. As the feeling entered my body, more and more, I began gingerly inching my hand towards my pocket. Perhaps in the darkened tunnel they wouldn't notice. Well, I said, if this is how it's gotta be, may a condemned man at least be granted some final words? Say your piece, young man. The leader nodded. I could feel my pocket knife slithering out of my jeans and into my hand. Have you heard the good news? I began to whisper, slowly descending into a roar. Make peace with your God. You're the one dying tonight. I jumped up, as quick as I could, and tackled the leader, plunging my pocket knife right into his neck. To this day, I'm still not exactly sure how I escaped the grasp of the other guys. Maybe it was divine intervention after all. Down the tunnel, in the distance, I could see a subway car stopped. I began my mad dash towards it, not even bothering to look back. All that mattered was getting out of there. Careful, don't damage him. The leader's blood-curdling scream echoed down the tunnel. No sooner than I jumped into the subway car was the door closing behind me. I leaned over to catch my breath, and I could hear the trio banging on the door, eager to tear through it and mutilate me. When I looked back up, I realized something. This car was empty. Where was everyone? For a second, I thought maybe I had wandered onto an abandoned line, or perhaps maybe one that was undergoing repairs, or something of that nature. After searching the car up and down, I happened to notice there was actually one other person around. He was hunched over, in a seat at the opposite end. One of his legs was stretched out across the seats. He was so engrossed in his foot that he didn't even seem to notice I was there. Hello, sir? Can you hear me? I began to inch myself closer towards him. I need some help. I'm under attack. Still no response. The guy clearly lived around these parts. I was maybe 2 or 3 seats away, but I could clearly see what he was up to. One of his shoes was off. Not that the dirty, eviscerated pair was doing him any good anyway. And his socks were rolled up, all the way down past his foot. I stared in horror as I watched him peel off dead, almost rotting flesh. His foot oozed blood, and had something poking through it, which I can only assume were parts of his bone, which he was gnawing at, profusely. The banging on the door started again. One of the attackers on the outside began to holler. Cyrus? You there? Go on, get him. He stopped chomping away at his foot, and looked up at me, one eye peering through his lengthy hair. I took off, and headed into the next car as quick as I could. Now I had this crazy feral guy on my ass. His foot didn't even seem to be a hindrance to him. My lungs burned with red-hot intensity. as I tried my best to keep my distance between me and him. If there was any chance of me getting out of this now, I needed to get to the center of the train, to the conductor's area. It was my only hope of getting off the train, and perhaps onto a station platform. Before I knew what even happened, I tripped while in a mid-run and banged my head against one of the seats, allowing Crazy Foot Guy to catch up with me. I was so dizzy and confused that I just started kicking and hoped for the best. I thought I was done for when he let out a monstrous howl that sounded almost more wolf than human. Almost immediately afterwards, there was dead silence. Not even a peep from a mouse or any other rodent. Just like that, he was gone. Maybe I hit him in a soft spot on his foot when I was kicking away. I got up and looked around. My eye was throbbing from where I had fallen, and I could already tell it was going to swell up like a balloon. My heart was beating faster than it had before, but I tried my best to remain cool and collected. About a minute or so later, I made it into the conductor's car. I had a throbbing headache, and at this point, didn't give a crap about anything at this point. I pushed every button and pulled every lever, and hoped for the best. A loud, thunderous moan began to conquer the silence as the doors slowly opened up. I'm not sure what station I was at exactly, but I could tell this one hadn't been used in a while, for whatever reason. I began to step onto the platform, when an uncomfortable thought completely overtook me and froze me in my tracks. With everything open now, who's to say they weren't out there, just waiting for me to step off the train? When I was sure the coast was clear, I made my way through the station, as inconspicuous as I could, and headed for the first set of stairs that made themselves known. Just a few more steps to freedom. I never thought I'd be so happy to smell the fresh air of New York again. I remember just making it outside, catching that first glimpse of a yellow taxi and a hot dog vendor, before I collapsed into the ground in exhaustion, and everything went black. When I came to, this time I was in a hospital, hooked up to IVs and unsure of what day it was anymore. I had sworn to myself that no one would ever know what happened to me, but like I said, life had other plans. After the doctors and nurses were sure I was stable, the police were among my first visitors, followed by my parents. My mom sobbing her eyes out. I did my best to work with the authorities, but no one was ever found down there. Nobody even came forward to identify themselves as the ones who helped me in my original scuffle. That was the last time I ever took the subway, and I will never go down there again. On my last day in the hospital, I received an anonymous bouquet of get well flowers, with a card that read, "Perhaps you have found peace after all, young man. Enjoy it while you can. My friends and I will be waiting for you when you come back."